So safe to say a fair few of you liked my last video about the alt-right elements of the furry and brony communities. Now if you haven't checked out my other work since that video, what I usually do with various sub-communities of fascist groups is take a deep dive look into them through a video. So I was wondering what to do for the next one, and one I've always wanted to cover is about paganism and fascism, and how these symbols that have traditionally been used by fascists are gaining more prominence in the modern fascist movements like the alt-right. So today what we're going to do is talk about the history of these symbols within fascist movements, talk about how prominent fascists use them today, talk about why they like this stuff, and then we're also going to read a little bit from people who used to be pagan fascists and read them talking about these things and why they joined these movements and why these symbols were appealing. But before we go any further, if you want to support my work, please like the video and maybe subscribe to the channel and maybe share the video. When I cover things like this, my videos are always demonetized, so if you want to support me at all financially, please check out my Patreon in the description. And if you want to talk about these things with me and other people, please also join the Kavernacle subreddit and join the Discord. Both of those are in the description. So if we start with the history of fascists using these pagan symbols, I guess the most obvious example is Nazi Germany and the Nazi party there. The swastika, although having links to India and Hinduism, is actually also a pagan symbol, specifically a Saxon pagan symbol, but they have also found this symbol throughout, Norse culture as well. So that type of Saxon symbol was adopted. The Nazis also loved the Roman Empire. Now, of course, the Roman Empire went through various different phases, but it was pagan at a point. But if you see, old school Nazi marches and the use of things like the eagle banner and everything like that, it's pretty clear the Nazis did love this pagan army's imagery, even though of course the Roman Empire became the seat of Christianity by its fall. But for most of the empire's existence, it believed in this more pagan religion, which most of you will also know about, and is of course an offshoot of Greek religion and the Greek myths we know today. But also what I want to talk about is why the Nazis liked pagan symbols. Now, of course, the popular imagery of pagan symbols comes from a group of natives. So pagan religion often comes from the native groups of a country. So when you talk about Norse mythology, this was like the golden age of Vikings. And of course all these Vikings were white. All these Vikings were from Denmark and from Norway. And there wasn't a lot of multiculturalism. There was no, black Vikings or any other colour. They all stayed within their tribe. And also talking about Viking religion and Norse mythology, there's a whole big thing about honouring your ancestors and everything. So that plays into the more nativist, tribal element where it's all very, very insular. Later we're going to talk about how that's a bit of a myth, but this is the popular image. So you see this throughout the pagan fascist groups, whether they're from places like Germany or from Denmark or from Norway or from Britain or from Ireland. It's basically they are thinking about the past where the race was pure, the race was all together, there was no outside influence undermining it, and wouldn't it be great if we went back to those times? So still on the topic of history and, the Germans' love for this pagan stuff, there was a good article by Vice titled "Racists Are Threatening to Take Over Paganism," and they outline some of the contemporary history here. So they say, Russian mystic Helena Petrovna Blavatsky is one figure whose race-related writings from the late 1800s continue to be controversial. Her idea was that humanity evolved from several root races. The most famous interpreters of a more racist view of her work about root races are German, Austrian, esoteric writers of the early 1900s like Guido List and George Lanz von Liebenfels, who are often seen as the primary founder of Ariosophy, which is a development of theosophy that saw the Aryan race as divine. Her work is also admired by modern racists like Tony Hovata, the Nazi sympathizer next door, who was profiled by the New York Times in 2017. While this does seem pretty similar to the Nazis' views on stuff like this, people who followed these two figures and these two writers were actually purged from the Nazi party because they had their own people who believed in, paganism and the occult, who had their own views on this stuff, so they didn't want people who followed Guido List or Liebenfels to take over the pagan ideology of the party with their views. So one symbol you saw back then was the Ophala rune, which is a Saxon pagan symbol, and we're going to use this as a through line to contemporary fascists who love to use this stuff. So this symbol is used by members of the alt-right and far-right in America today. On screen, hopefully right now, I am showing you some pictures of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, and you can see this rune being displayed on shields and everything else like that. Also, there's a picture I'm going to put up from another rally where they're burning a swastika and burning a rune as well. So it's pretty clear this imagery has survived as a symbol of fascism. And of course, like I said earlier, why these symbols are appealing is because they harken back to a time of, I guess, a racial solidarity for these people, a time where Germany was pure, where the ancestors of these American people, because a lot of Americans have ancestors from Germany, where they hadn't been undermined by, for example, Muslim refugees, or, you know, things like Germany's relationship with Turkey, where it's a lot easier for Turkish migrants to go to Germany and settle. But it's basically telling everyone else, you know, get out, this is an exclusive club for people with a certain race and a certain lineage. Now, sticking on the topic of Charlottesville, Richard Spencer actually said that a man called Augustus Sol Invictus, who is a pagan who used to be in the Libertarian Party and ran against Marco Rubio for the Senate, not that he did very well, I think he got something like 1,000 votes. He wrote the first draft of the Charlottesville Statement. Now, with a name like Sol Invictus, you can probably guess this guy changed his name to fit in more with his pagan views. But just to read you a tiny bit of the Charlottesville Statement to get the gist of what this guy believes. So for number one, on race, for their statement, it said, race is real, race matters, race is the foundation of identity. White is shorthand for a worldwide constellation of peoples, each of which is derived from the Indo-European race often called Aryan. And this is interesting that European refers to a core stock, Celtic, Germanic, Hellenic, Latin, Nordic and Slavic, from which related cultures and a shared civilization sprang. And that's an interesting small wrinkle because, of course, German Nazis didn't think Slavic people were equal. They didn't think all these different people were equal, including Latins as well, to an extent. But it's not surprising a guy who believes in all the pagan stuff includes all these different groups that can be compatible with his pagan views. And because these people all believe in, you know, white genocide and everything like that, I think I should read point 6 of the Charlottesville Statement, which is titled Europe, and says, Europe is our common home, and our ancestors' bone and blood lie in its soil. European unity emerged at critical points in history, but so did fragmentation, rivalry and betrayal. As brother nations, Europeans have competed with one another and even hated and killed one another. We can no longer afford the luxury of interracial squabbling. Brother wars gain us nothing and directly lead to our collective downfall. Europeans must come together as a family. The so-called refugee crisis is an invasion, a war without bullets, taking place on the fields of race, religion, sex and morality. At stake is Europe's very identity, the locus of our people's shared story, or become just another Islamic outpost. So pagan neo-Nazis aren't isolated to the people who are at Charlottesville, it's a bit more widespread. So the Vice article I mentioned does paint a good picture of other more violent acts by pagan neo-Nazis. So to the outside world, the far-right association with ancient gods and magic might seem absurd, but it's actually been tied up with specific acts of violence and terrorism. One member of Virginia's neo-pagan white nationalist group, the Wolves of Vinland, Maurice Michaeli, spent more than 2 years in prison for burning down a black church in 2012. A free man now, Facebook post from 2015 suggests he's back at work with the Wolves. In November 2015, 3 individuals with connections to the Atsura Folk Assembly, who were also involved in Charlottesville, were arrested in conjunction with a plot to ignite a race war, and in 2017, self-proclaimed Viking and white supremacist Jeremy Christian was charged with stabbing 2 people to death on a train in Portland, Oregon. So we spoke about the history of these pagan symbols in fascism, and we spoke about more contemporary fascists. But we haven't spoke as much as why people are attracted to these symbols. Broadly, we have in the sense that it's referencing to these idealized cultures of, you know, racial harmony and fascist opinions. There's a guy called Arno Michaelis who's an Odinist, but he was also a leader in the white power movement in the 80s and 90s. So in the same article, he talks about this. So he performed as a lead singer of the skinhead band called Centurion and organised followers under the banner of white nationalism. Today he's an activist against racism and the author of the book My Life After Hate. Michaelis is one of the co-founders of the organisation Serve to Unite, a group created after a white supremacist conducted a mass shooting at a Sikh temple in Milwaukee on August 5th, 2012, killing 6. So he talks about the draw to paganism. For me, the biggest draw to racist paganism was it really pissed people off. Beyond that, it really made me feel like I was a warrior for my people. It gave me a sense of power and importance. Michaelis said there are many ways for people to fall into the trap of racism. He argued that the general pattern, one of suffering people, and said if you are completely happy and contented with your life, you have absolutely no reason to get involved in that bullshit. His goal is to now reach out to people in the white power movement and break the cycle before it's too late. Now, I guess that's one element I didn't touch on as much, is of course, when you're talking about Vikings, you're talking about Saxons, you're talking about the Anglo-Saxons, it's a history that is steeped in warfare and conquering. It's obviously a very interesting period in where I'm from, Britain, when you had the Danes, the Vikings coming in, you had the Anglo-Saxons and you had the Celts fighting each other for territory and having, I guess, this cultural exchange as well, because they did live side by side in many territories, and that's how you get Anglo-Saxons, because of course Saxons are from Germany like we spoke about before. But it's a period of battle, it's a period of these legendary figures made even more popular by series like Vikings, by other shows like The Last Kingdom, where you see this time of adventure, you see the period of history that inspired the works like Lord of the Rings. And when you're thinking about these groups and tribal people and their warriors and they're fighting for their homelands and they're fighting for their religion, they're fighting for their ancestors, they're fighting to get into Valhalla and sit with all the warriors who have died before them, you can see why militant fascists will be attracted to this. He also makes a good point, which I spoke about before, is that if your life is going fine, if you're mentally stable, if you haven't fallen on hard times and all that sort of stuff, joining fascist movements is far less appealing. Of course, you're always going to have these intellectual fascists who normally come from more privileged upbringings and learn their racist ideology through, works by previous fascist writers, through all this different stuff. But to become the foot soldiers, you're normally looking for someone to blame, or you're looking to feel a void in your life, or like a lot of work done on these fascist groups, you're looking for a sense of community. Combine that with paganism, combine that with the mythicized view of these groups about community, tribal community, and protecting that tribe, then you can see why pagan fascism can be very appealing. Now, in my furry and brony video that I made last week, a lot of people were saying that I didn't do enough to show both sides, that how most furries and bronies are just regular people. And I did do that in my previous videos, but I'll admit I didn't do that in the last video. So with that in mind, let's just talk about the pagans who are against the fascist pagans. So the article said, some pagans have tried to combat the spread of racism within their ranks. They formed advocacy groups like Heathens United Against Racism, and as true community, these groups have banded together in public pronouncements. In August 2016, 43 pagan organisations signed Declaration 127, a public renunciation of any heathenry that promotes hatred or discrimination. Since then, that number has grown to more than 180 organisations in over 20 countries, and in 2017, TAC created the Shield Wall, a manifesto compelling heathens around the world to denounce all those abusing the heathen faith to spread hatred and negativity. So going back to Michaelis as well, he also has his forearms covered in pagan symbols, but he explained that the culture of Northern Europe and the Middle East have been intertwined for thousands of years, and pointed to a long history of Vikings trading with Arabic peoples in the ancient world as a counter to the narrative of white separatists. He says that history gets completely lost in their fear and ignorance. And to end on that, fascists always have this mythicized history. Vikings didn't just exist in Norway and Denmark and maybe moved to England and set up their own kingdoms there. If you read about the history of Vikings, it's very interesting. Many travel to the Middle East and work as mercenaries for both Arab Muslims and the Byzantines, who are Orthodox Christians. You actually have stories of Vikings going over there and converting to Islam. So it's very interesting, and just like a lot of this history that is fed to you by whatever, school or popular works, you might get an image that is not necessarily true. And on a little tangent, that's why I appreciate things like the Assassin's Creed games, because even in the most recent one, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, they even touch on this with your stepbrother Sigurd, who's gone travelling to the Middle East and brings back 2 assassins who I guess probably pose as Muslims, but of course assassins don't believe in religion. But even for someone like me who knew about Vikings going to the Middle East, it's still important to see it is a feasible thing that you could probably travel from Denmark to the Middle East and come back in one piece and spread what you have learnt there, and that the world even back then in 800 AD, in 900 AD, in 1000 AD was more interconnected than you'd first think, and these groups did have cultural exchanges at times. It's not just like this image of the Crusades that we think of, that, oh, the Christians and the Pagans, when they first saw each other, they just kill each other, or when they saw Muslims, they just kill them because they hated each other so bad. No, these groups often did work together, and history has always been groups that have become interconnected through things like trade. But when you're a fascist, you have to feed people a mythicized view of history, because otherwise your messaging falls apart pretty quickly under historical scrutiny. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Are there any other topics like this you'd like me to cover? I got a couple in my head that I've researched and I'm going to make in the future, but let me know if there's anything in particular. If you want to support my work, please check out my Patreon in the description. If you want to find me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join my Discord, that is in the description with everything else. If you want to join my subreddit, that is in there too. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.